Hello, my name is Sarah Glasser. I teach in Wright, Wyoming. I teach mostly German and some ESL. And so this is my task 1C video reflection activity. And this is where I talk about the modeling of, my model is chunking. So chunking happens during the direct instruction portion of a lesson. It's necessary as a component when students are asked to learn a large amount of content. The instructor can help students be successful and master the seemingly overwhelming amount by breaking the information down into manageable pieces. As a German teacher, I'm implementing this model in two of my levels. In German 1, this is their family unit, and in German 2, it's their chores unit. Chunking has three components. Initially, the instructor needs to know ahead of time that chunking will be necessary to implement as an effective model of instruction. Either the instructor has taught the material before and has previously recognized the need, and that was my case this time, or data is collected to show students are struggling and need the extra support. The data can help the instructor determine the amount of support needed. If students already have some background knowledge of the new content, the instructor may implement larger chunks. In German 1, the family unit, which is Unit 2, we have previously already talked about names in the first unit, but they learned how to talk about their own name. However, this is previous background knowledge that they may draw from. This was also the case when they talked about their age. It was their own age, and now they're asked in the second unit to talk about a family member's age. So I'm not sure if it's a weakness to this model or not, but students are asked, it's a challenge because they're asked to change the endings in this language. Much like we use first person, different endings to our verbs compared to third person, German does that as well. So whereas first unit, they had previously learned how to use the I form, like I am Robert, I am 14 years old. This is an additional challenge to be able to change from that first person to third person knowledge of the different ending on the verb. So now they're saying my mother's name is Hannah, my mother is 33 years old. But it does set them up for some success, at least. In German 2, the chores unit, we have talked about frequency. Last year in Unit 3, they learned hobbies, and they talked about how frequently they did a hobby. So they can draw that from that on their background knowledge. So that was the first point. The second point is students need the chunking to be presented in manageable pieces and in a logical order. And I'm kind of needing help with that because I'm a little more eclectic, and the gold personality is kind of tough for me, so I have to remind myself in my planning, keep it in the logical order for them. So German 1 is asked to talk about their family, the relationship, is it their mother or father, their name, the age, their hair color, their eye color, and what job they do. So students may pick whichever order they like or feel is logical. Students make slides with cues in English or visual cues to help them remember each piece to say about 3 different family members. I randomly choose those so they don't necessarily just memorize and spit it back out. They have to know the process so that they can choose 3 out of the 10 celebrity slides that the students create themselves. Some students don't know the schema of a family tree, so sometimes we have to teach that explicitly and start at the top and say, okay, start with your grandma, grandpa, work down the next generation, and end with like brother, sister, and cousins. We discuss the situation to make it meaningful to them. They're describing their fake family members to a classmate from Germany or a pen pal from Germany. We talk about which information is logically first So who would you, when you're talking about somebody, you probably want to start with who they are. Are they their mother, father, maybe then their name to gather some connection to the person, their age, which we said was kind of familiar to them from the first unit, and then work their way down to harder or newer nuances like hair and eye color. And lastly, the most challenging probably for them is the job. So leave that to the end, as these are newer components for students. So they do have the artistic license on order, but we are asked to maybe organize them on the slide to keep track of that order. In German 2, for the chores, students are asked to say who does which chore at home, and then they add the frequency and the duration, so how long is the chore being done, and where, what room, for instance. So it was most logical, I noticed, because I tried it a different way first, for them to start with a chore, and after looking at a vocab list of chores, think, okay, who in my household does this chore? And this was familiar to them from their German 1 unit, Unit 2 of family, because they could talk about who at home does it. Is it my sister, my brother, my mother? So then they were able to add the frequency and how long after that. And lastly, rooms were introduced to their vocabulary as the chunking. So back to kind of the data part of chunking, the instructor constantly is checking for student understanding and reteaching before moving to the next chunk. The instructor can determine which content is a priority and which can be left out. Some jobs were too complicated, for instance, in German 1 with their family tree. So for instance, one wanted to say, how do you say YouTube beeinflusser or influencer? And I was like, we might not want to take that on right now. We might just want to simplify it to the word actor, because that comes up a lot. Schauspieler might sound complicated, but it's one that they've used over and over again. Repetition. Although some students found some things difficult, I feel it is a strength of this model that students are able to choose what is interesting to them. Our school district in Campbell County, Wyoming, where I teach, has provided us professional development through the Schlechte Center, and Dr. Philip Schlechte's research showed how important choice is for students. A second strength of this model is students are able to extend their learning as much as they feel comfortable. One example of this in the family unit was learning strange colors, for instance. They didn't want to stop at just brown hair and blue eyes. They wanted to have yellow eye color. So they extended their learning to be able to say gelbe Augen. In presenting, they may repeat the sentence over and over and just say, my mother's name is, my mother's age is, my mother has brown hair, or they may change it up and say, this is my mother. She, and use the pronoun, she has brown hair, she is 35. So that was another way to push a student to be creative with their learning, or if they felt more comfortable just saying, my mother, in that pattern, they could stick to that. In German 2, we limited the rooms to only those needed to be talked about in their chores. We didn't talk about all the rooms in the house yet. The next part of this unit will have them design a dream house, so all the rooms will be introduced later. But on this unit, we just exposed them to those ones that they needed. Whereas this was a weakness for some students. If they didn't learn a certain room and they had to do the interpreting a peer's presentation, they're like, oh, well, I didn't have that one in mind, so I didn't know what they were saying. That was one weakness. Whereas a strength for German 2 is they could see how German likes to create compound words. So you take the pieces and you smush them together in really long words. But as long as you're able to see these are pieces that you can then break apart to be able to comprehend it, it's not that hard. So they discovered laundry room, for instance, is just a smush together of kitchen and wash kitchen. So they knew wasch and Küche, and they just smushed it together to Waschküche. And that was then in their grasp. They could do that. And then this final component in the planning process, I guess, students need time to process the new information. Cooperative learning and group work may provide students opportunities to work together processing the content. So in terms of this lesson with the family, I modeled how to present the information for the students. Students had time to process how they would present their information, and then students practiced their sentences in pairs with peers. We did a jigsaw activity to present pieces individually in front of the whole group came last. So in chores for German 2, I modeled how to create a sentence with the 5 elements. Students had a formative assessment with a visual, and I used color coding so that each element had a different color so the students could see each element in the sentence. Students were asked to create a first draft of their own sentences, and then they used peer editing as a first level of edit, and then I helped do a final edit. Then students created a visual for each of their sentences to make it more meaningful and present to the class their 5 sentences. So back to the planning. After presenting the content, the next step is the students process it. So to provide instructors data, the students are to show that the students are comprehending. Students complete formative assessments, like I had just mentioned. Students record and represent content. The instructor can assess if students require additional support or if they're ready to move on, if they get it. So for me in German 1 family, describing the planning process using specific components or subcomponents of the model. That maybe shouldn't have been German. That should be German 2. I'm sorry. I know I have a unit in German 2 about household chores. So I've taught it before, as I mentioned. So I know it's complex. It's asking students to master a large amount of vocabulary, and then they have to formulate that in the correct order. And it's kind of sounding like Yoda in German, so it's a little bit confusing. To make sure that they cover each area of how long the chore is done, where, how frequently or often, and who and which chore it is. So the teacher describes how he or she decides which components of the model will be emphasized within a given unit plan and to the related lesson plans. So in German 1 family, students are asked to first present the areas of relationship. Is it my mom, dad, their name, their age, their hair color, their eye color, and their job. Students are asked to interpret peer presentations next. So after presenting, they get the feel of the vocabulary. Then they watch a peer's presentation. So they're interpreting. Lastly, students do an interpersonal task with the initial presentation. So they're getting it in the different modes of a language. Basically, first off, you're presenting, so you're mostly speaking. It can be written as well. Then you're interpreting, hearing, or reading the information from a peer. And then lastly, the interpersonal is that dialogue between the two, the cooperative learning. All right, the last portion is another example of building up the students one more level, because they've shown mastery of the presentation and they're asked to interpret, so they've practiced that information again, recycling that. But This last level, they're asked to listen and read and then speak or write the reply. So they're asked to do all the modes basically. So you need a lot more vocabulary to be able to ask a peer questions about the family, like who is that? They need the skill to ask a question. What is your mother's name? How old is your mother? Does your mother have brown hair? Does your mother have blue eyes? Is your mother an actress? As well as answer the questions. They have to play both roles. In German 2, chores, students are asked to present on 5 chores their family members do. In addition, they have to explain, like we said, how often, the duration, and the location. They add a visual, and after presenting, they also interpret the peer's presentation. They're asked to fill out a spreadsheet in English so that we can see if they're actually comprehending the language that they're putting into the spreadsheet. One weakness in German 2 of this model was that when they interpreted their peers, like I said, a few had used terms that the peer had not presented on their own, hadn't had exposure to it at first on their own, so that when they interpreted a peer, they were like, I didn't know that one, that was new to me. One specific example is one person said they did it alle 2 Wochen, that's every 2 weeks, and instead of jede zweite Woche, every second week. So it's basically saying the same thing, but it was kind of a stretch for them to comprehend because it wasn't the exact phrasing that they had done themselves. And lastly, students ask a peer the interpersonal. So who does what chore, when, so frequency, also duration, and where. And they're asked to ask that 3 times. The peer replies, and then the roles reverse to ask and have the other peer reply. So I'm not sure if I'm doing this correctly, so bear with me on my first attempt at the highly refined teacher. Thank you for your opportunity.